Okay, so before you rake me over the coals for starting with Gen 1 Pokémon when I literally just talked about it in the introduction, please understand that this was not my original intention for the beginning of the series. I was going to begin with the boss subtitles from Ocarina of Time, and I had these grand plans to talk about how boss battles in the Zelda series slowly evolved from basically just slightly more difficult enemy encounters, in some cases less difficult, actually, to intricately designed set pieces with their own special room designs, combat mechanics, and backstories for the bosses as characters. This is still something I might do eventually, but while I was conceptualizing that video, I came to a distressing conclusion. Boss subtitles are not flavor text according to the criteria I laid out in the last video. They're flavorful, alright, and they're not strictly necessary from either a story or a gameplay perspective, but they're also not optional. Every player is bound to see them while watching game-critical cutscenes, so they're not something you discover while playing the game. They're something that the designers push in front of you and expect you to notice. I would be more inclined to call this story text than flavor text. You see, the thing about flavor text is that, at least as I've defined it, it's very gamey and plays to the strengths of video games as a medium, one of which is the freedom to explore a fictional world. Ocarina of Time's boss subtitles are much more cinematic, like the subtitles that pop up in movies sometimes, to tell you the location and time of day for a certain scene. This isn't a knock against games trying to be cinematic, by the way. I love games that manage to convey a sense of cinematic drama, but try as I might, I can't think of that drama as having anything to do with the purpose and qualities of flavor text. So even though Ocarina of Time is one of the first video games that I played through on my own, and certainly the first one to have a dialogue-heavy, cutscene-driven story in it, it's not the first game that was memorable for me because of its optional flavor text. That game is Pokémon Blue, and the specific flavor text I'm talking about is not the game's silly NPC dialogue, although believe me, there's some choice cuts here in that department, but something that could be just as silly, despite ostensibly being informative: the Pokédex. For every unique Pokémon you catch, the game gives you a little 2-page blurb telling you its height, weight, index number, and an interesting fact about it, along with an epithet like the Superpower Pokémon, or the Scratch Cat Pokémon, or the Atrocious Pokémon. One curious thing about the Pokédex is that despite all the entries in it being totally optional and irrelevant to gameplay, completing it is presented as one of the 2 major goals that your protagonist is trying to achieve, the other one being to defeat the Elite Four and claim the title of greatest Pokémon trainer in the world. Now you would think that being the very best, like no one ever was, would be a much more prominent and desirable goal than just filling out a bunch of entries in a glorified encyclopedia. But actually, the game presents the 2 objectives as equally important, and Professor Oak, your mentor, I guess, seems to care much more about completing the Pokédex. His aides don't give you helpful items for beating gym leaders or stopping Team Rocket's nefarious schemes. They do it when you've caught a certain number of Pokémon. He doesn't seem to give a toss that your rival, who I might remind you is his own grandson, managed to beat the Elite Four, and when you talk to him after doing the same thing yourself, Oak's reaction is basically, "Well, that's wonderful. Now you'll have lots of free time to go and finish the Pokédex like I asked you to before I catch a severe case of old man-ingitis and die." And the rest of the game mostly reinforces this impression that the point isn't so much to win the game and see the credits roll by, as it is to fulfill Professor Oak's dream of knowing what every single Pokémon is like. Satoshi Tajiri said more than once in interviews that he designed his game to appeal to kids' natural impulse to collect things, like his own childhood insect collection, which he looked back on with great fondness and nostalgia. Also, there's the fact that the phrase "gotta catch 'em all" was so ubiquitous in the franchise's early years that it became more or less its official slogan, despite the fact that actually catching all the Pokémon in the Pokédex has gradually transformed from a difficult and time-consuming achievement to one that would literally be impossible if you didn't attend specific limited-time events, and then to something that was just impossible, period, no matter what you did. But hey, original slogans are made to be broken. Isn't that right? Google, EA, and, let's be honest here, Snapple. Anyway, the point is that the Pokédex ends up being a lot more prominent than you would expect a collection of flavor text snippets to be. It's still technically optional, since you don't have to catch any Pokémon to beat the game, and yet it's clearly one of the game's major hooks. Few RPGs either before or since the original Pokémon, including its own sequels, have emphasized their flavor text so much and given it pride of place over more dramatic story elements like saving the world or achieving fame and fortune. I think that a big part of the original Pokémon's appeal, and by extension an important reason for the popularity of the whole franchise, is the fact that it takes more inspiration from the real world we live in than it does from other RPGs, and the Pokédex reflects this same down-to-earth attitude. The blurbs about various Pokémon have a lot of that fun fact quality that you tend to see in educational books for children, like Golden Guides or the DK Eyewitness series, as well as cereal boxes and, well, Snapple. Despite their fantastical appearance and powers, in the context of the first-generation games, Pokémon themselves are treated in very much the same way that we treat ordinary animals, and Pokémon trainers exist somewhere on a continuum between a biologist or forest ranger on one end and a dog trainer on the other. Stressing the importance of completing the Pokédex, or in other words of gaining knowledge, is the game's way of trying to contextualize all the fighting you do, so that it doesn't seem like the point of all this is to fight. Incidentally, this is also why Pokémon faint instead of dying when they run out of HP. Tajiri really did not want kids to think this was anything like dogfighting or other blood sports. While the game is still too goal-directed in both the short and long term to be directly comparable with something like Harvest Moon or Animal Crossing, what fascinates me about Pokémon is how much it feels like those games. How it sells the feeling of just fooling around and discovering things, even when you're involved in pretty important things happening around you. Pokémon Blue was a game I used to play all the time while being driven around town by my parents, and it's perfectly suited to that kind of short-term, half-distracted play. In a way, flavor text was made for games like this. I don't think it's any coincidence that Pokémon became a trading card game within months of its initial release, and then a video game version of that trading card game, but let's not go down that rabbit hole right now. The entries in the Pokédex accomplish the same thing for Pokémon Red and Blue that Magic the Gathering's blurbs did for it. They helped to activate the player's imagination and compensate for an admittedly simplistic presentation. The Pokédex tells what the Game Boy is incapable of showing on screen. And before you jump in with show don't tell, let me remind you that that's a cinematic axiom, and video games are not movies. With its offbeat story and unusual structure and mechanics, Pokémon was never going to appeal to hardcore RPG fans. It was made for little kids with interests outside of video games, and I think its genius was in understanding and weaving into the experience so many ideas which kids like. Fluffy animals, superpowers, high-tech machinery, dinosaurs, puns, funny-looking people who say weird things, and above all, collecting and trading stuff with other kids. And what would anything made for kids be without randomly inserted fun facts? Leaving those out would be like spitting in the face of childhood itself, and then knocking it down and taking its lunch money. So before we move on to the next file, I'd like to take a look at 6 Pokédex entries that exemplify the intriguing inutility of Gen 1's unique approach to flavor text. Why 6? Because you can't have more than 6 entries in a Pokémon Hall of Fame. Duh. Let's start with Blastoise, the shellfish Pokémon. Yeah, whatever you say. According to the Pokédex, Blastoise is 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighs 189 pounds. Smaller than I imagined, actually. And apparently it's a brutal Pokémon with pressurized water jets on its tail, which are used for high-speed tackles. Blastoise is pretty unusual for a Gen 1 Pokémon in that it's biological with mechanical parts. That came to be a pretty common combination in later generations, but in Gen 1 they were generally either all organic or something like Magnemite, which is more like a machine that's come to life. I think in this case the character is inspired by the kaiju monster Gamera, which is also a turtle that fires jets out its backside to slam into things. I always thought Blastoise was the weirdest of the fully evolved starter Pokémon, and neither time nor the Pokédex entry has changed that impression. Next up we have Alakazam, the Psy Pokémon, of which it is said, its brain can outperform a supercomputer. Its intelligence quotient is said to be 5,000. This is so overstated it feels like a kid wrote it. No one's ever even invented an IQ test that can score above 300. It's like saying you got a 5,000 on your SATs. Even when I was a kid, I knew this entry was stupid. It felt like a couple of 5th graders trying to one-up each other on the playground. Like, yeah, well, my IQ's 1,000,000. Oh yeah, well, my IQ is your mom. Voltorb, the ball Pokémon. I love this one just for the phrasing. Usually found in power plants. Easily mistaken for a Pokéball, they have zapped many people. Voltorb was already a pretty clever way to translate the idea of a mimic into the Pokémon world, but what really makes this for me is the idea that people in this world routinely wander around abandoned power plants looking for useful objects. This is a very bizarre niche for an organism to evolve into, I have to say. Rhyhorn, the Spikes Pokémon. Rhyhorn is clearly based on a rhinoceros, but oddly it's described as being about 3 feet 3 inches tall, much shorter than an actual rhinoceros, and weighing 254 pounds, which is around 1/10 of the weight of a rhinoceros. Its entry states, its bones are 1,000 times harder than human bones. It can easily knock a trailer flying. Real rhinos can't even flip a truck over, and they can weigh more than a ton. I don't care how hard your bones are. If you weigh 250 pounds, you are not going to send a trailer twinkling through the air like Team Rocket after being thundershocked. I don't know, maybe they're talking about this kind of trailer, but that's not terribly impressive. I could probably toss that thing around, and you don't see me being listed in encyclopedias of exotic creatures. Well, not yet. Mr. Mime, the barrier Pokémon. Mr. Mime was already one of the weirder Pokémon in Gen 1, but the Pokédex description really paints a picture. If interrupted while it is miming, it will slap around the offender with its broad hands. This happens in real life too, by the way, so just watch yourself around mimes. They're silent, but deadly. And we'll end with an all-time classic, Snorlax. Very lazy, just eats and sleeps. As its rotund bulk builds, it becomes steadily more slothful. You ever get the impression that Snorlax is the only truly happy character in the entire Pokémon franchise? Because I do. And in imitation of that example, I'm just going to end the video right here and take a nap. See you next file.